A very good morning, everyone. A couple years ago, Professor Danny Roderick and we had a very intensive discussions on what the global economic order will be look like. And then we decided to write a book together with experts in the fields. After we accomplished the book, we come up with thousands of more questions. And here we are today. I'm very pleased we're gonna discuss and go through the questions. Joining me tonight today, Professor Danny Roderick. Professor Justin Yifulin. Professor Jayati Ghosh. Professor Lorenzo Caliando. Over the last 50 years, we have been witnessing the global economy increase more than 35 times from 3 trillion US dollar in 1970 to 117 trillion in 2025. Looking ahead, the global economy will be shaped by digital technologies, robotics, and AI. Throughout these transformations, we have been facing profound challenges: rising inequality, automations replacing jobs, and existential human threat of climate change. With these transformations, are we really witnessing the globalizations, or is it the reconfigurations of globalizations? Now let's hear what we're gonna hear from experts today. Let me start with Danny, please.
Thank you, Lily. It's wonderful to be here, and thanks a lot for our wonderful hosts for this great venue. It's wonderful to be here, and the organization has just been amazing. Before we get into the substance, I actually want to put in an additional plug for this book. Lily mentioned this book that we edited, but I just wanted to make sure that I wanted to list a little bit about sort of what's included in the book, because I want to encourage you it's free. You can download it. It starts with a historical overview that Kevin O'Rourke has written. It has a couple of chapters that I've co-authored with Joe Stiglitz, one on global governance in the new era and one on new development strategies. It has a chapter by Sujiro Urata on regional and bilateral and plurilateral cooperation, a chapter by Danny Quah on a fractured world order, chapter by Lily and Justin. They've co-authored on economic transformation and new economic order. A chapter by Daron Acemoglu on how to govern AI in a multipolar world. A chapter by Alessio Terzi on the Green Industrial Revolution. Jose Antonio Ocampo on international financial and tax reforms. Jayati Ghosh on how to mobilize resources for global development and health. Vera Songwe, chapter by Vera Songwe on using market mechanisms to address financial constraints and deliver better growth. I hope I haven't not left anybody out, but I think this should give you a sense of how exciting this book is. With regard to the specific question, I like to think about the future of the global economic order in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So there are three possible scenarios. The bad, I think, is kind of a return to the interwar period of a return to extreme bilateralism, collapse of trade. I don't think that that's going to happen. I think the world economy is too integrated. The costs would be too high, so absent a major shock and a major global geopolitical conflict, I don't think the bad scenario is likely. The ugly scenario, I think, is much more likely. The ugly scenario, I think, of one where increasingly the kinds of geopolitical tensions around the world, which have come to dominate policymakers thinking about the world economy, become the primary way in which policymakers think about the international economy. And of course, we economists always think about the gains from trade as positive sum. Geopolitics is always zero sum. Anything I win, somebody else loses, and vice versa. So we start thinking about that. If geopolitics becomes the dominant frame, then economic interdependence becomes weaponized. That would not be, I think, a collapse of the global economic order, but it would, I think, yield a very ugly economic order. Then there's a good scenario. I think a good scenario, I view it as a kind of a return to the spirit of the Bretton Woods era, where I think there was a much more balanced understanding of the priorities of international economic development, domestic social cohesion, domestic economic priorities, and the demands of the international economy, a kind of a more balance between the domestic and the international agendas, which I think characterize the Bretton Woods period. So depending on which side of the bed I wake up, I think we'll end up either in the ugly scenario or in the good scenario. But in any case, I do think we're in a moment of transition, and it's not quite clear which way we're heading.
Thank you, Danny. What do you think, Justin?
Well, we have good time in the world. We also have bad time in the world. But no matter what kind of times a country is facing, the best strategies is always to do your homework well. The best way is always look at what you have now. Based on what you have, you can do well. And in a market economy, to have a facilitation state to scale up what you can do well. And by that kind of situation, you can have the strength by yourself, and you have the ability to navigate all kind of shock from all sides. And certainly, if we have a fair, rule-based, global orders, then under that kind of situation, every country can have a better opportunity to develop along the lines of their competitive advantages, and then can have a better divisional level and cooperate with other countries. But if we have a deglobalized under that kind of situation, the opportunity will become less. And under that kind of situation, certainly you may have to go to some areas which you do not have competitive advantages, and because you cannot trade with other countries, then you have to develop those kind of sectors by yourself. But the door is not fully closed. Opportunity of trade is always there. So under the kind of situation, I think the best way for the country is not to go too far away from your competitive advantages. Only those things you absolutely cannot import from outside, you need to develop by yourself. As long as you have opportunity to import from outside, the best way is still to follow your competitive advantages. And by that, you will gain your strength. And if we have a fully fair globalized world, then good, we take that opportunity. If there's no areas that because of the sanction from outside and so on, we need to do that, but we need to limit those kind of areas and follow your competitive advantage to the full as much as possible.
All right. Thank you so much. What do you think from developing countries' perspective, Jayati?
Well, in a way, I want to pick up on 2 points that both Danny and Justin made kind of separately. Danny, I think when you described, what you wake up in the morning depending on which side of the bed you wake up, you think that it will be good or ugly. The good is what you want to happen, right? And then there's the question of what you think is more likely to happen. So if we consider the medium term, 5 or 10 years up ahead, the good doesn't seem likely. And similarly, Justin, let's admit it, multilateralism is really in very, very dire straits right now. And we would all like to have a progressive multilateralism that is inclusive, et cetera, but it doesn't seem likely immediately. So what do developing countries do then for the next decade? And I would argue that we are entering, I mean, of course, interregnum, everybody suddenly discovered that one line of Gramsci, but yes, it is an interregnum. In that interregnum, how do you negotiate and navigate? I would argue that this is a time for shifting coalitions. It's happening. We can already see that there are different coalitions of countries for trade purposes, for other strategic purposes, and so on. But for the global majority countries, leaving out, I would say, US, also, sorry, Europe and China, if we leave them out, for the rest of the world, we have to think of resilience first. Because shocks, as you mentioned, are not just coming. We know that there are going to be many shocks in future. In the next 10 years, we are going to face different kinds of shocks. It's not just a question of your broader development strategy. It's how you are able to handle resilience to those shocks in that context. So if I can be a little putting it out there, I would say that one of the first things that developing countries would have to do is to reduce their integration in global capital markets. I think that that is something that has dramatically increased vulnerability to shocks. And we can see it all the time. We are vulnerable not just to the actual physical shocks or to wars, but we're vulnerable to changes in interest rates in the global north, all kinds of other things. So I would argue that to begin with, the global majority has to think of improving its resilience to shocks to be able to continue with their own development strategy, which really means being able to control the nature of finance and the kind of financial flows that come into your country.
Right, that's very interesting indeed. What do you see, Lorenzo?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's, talking about the book, I think it's a great book, freely accessed, so I would suggest people in the audience to actually read the book. So the question is about, are we seeing a reconfiguration or a deglobalization? I see more a reconfiguration compared to a deglobalization. I think we're not really moving to autarky. Trade is still large, measured in many ways in absolute value and relative to GDP. Not only trading goods, trading also in capital flows and trading ideas. And in fact, trading ideas, I can even argue today is even larger than before due to the fact that we have this new shock, which is AI. So I think it's important to basically emphasize that what has changed, I think, is the principle surrounding globalization. I think the older principle was about efficiency, and today we're moving to a different type of principle thinking about globalization. I think this old principle about efficiency, in a way, kind of saw two aspects of globalization. One, something that we always thought that, trade policy is inherently, basically, time inconsistent. You can actually think about a policy about free trade or lower tariff for many years. First, we'll invest according to that policy. They will actually have supply change, foreign direct investment, but a change in government can actually come tomorrow and realize that, because of government, policies or for political interests, they might come now and change trade policy. Now, the GATT in WTO, as we all think about it, one thinks that the main reason for the GATT and WTO is to facilitate trade, but the deeper aspect of the GATT and WTO was to generate policies that are somehow time consistent. And in that sense, in a way, seems to be that we're kind of in a crossroad and kind of failed. Now, the second thing that I think about the older globalization, which was focusing on allowing to facilitate trade and allow countries to specialize in their competitive advantage, is somehow these distributional effects from opening to trade. We saw yesterday on the presidential address, basically showing a lot of facts about how, yes, there's a lot of aggregate gains from globalization, but did come at the cost of a lot of distributional consequences. So what I see more going forward is more a reconfiguration, in principle, trying to address these issues which are about the distributional aspects of globalization that the old, if you want, model wasn't basically addressing. So what I see challenging today, it's a world that is moving from focusing on efficiency to a more model that is more focusing on managing efficiency together with resiliency, together with political considerations. So I don't think we're moving to a deglobalization. In my view, I see that we're moving more a reconfiguration, driven more by political interests and geopolitical considerations, and not so much on efficiency.
Right. That's very important indeed. So I think it seems like the panelists agree that we are in the process of reconfigurations, while many of developing countries, we need to improve resilience, and we need to improve like taking into our competitive and comparative advantage. Now the question is that most of the time developing countries are always put in the corners in this rivalry world. So how would you suggest developing countries to move forward, Danny?
Well, I mean, I do think that the point that Jayati made about shifting coalitions and emphasizing resilience is very important. I do think we're moving into a multipolar world, but we can move into a multipolar world that is going to be very unstable because the leading actors have not quite reconciled themselves to it. Clearly, the United States right now is not reconciled to a multipolar world. I don't know really about China. I don't know how China would view shifting coalitions in Asia, in East Asia, Southeast Asia, or whether it would insist on sort of all these sort of being essentially at the helm of it. And so I think that remains to be seen. And so we need to work towards a multipolar world. I think that's going to serve the interests of the developing world the best. I don't think, I remember actually under the auspices of the IEA, we held a virtual seminar where we asked a leading American foreign policy expert talking about US-China relations. And it was all based on sort of maintained assumption that the US somehow had to dominate technology and trade and set the rules without explicitly saying so. And then at some point, sort of, when we pushed him saying, okay, so, why not a multipolar world? And his basic answer was to say, would you rather live under American rule or would you rather live under Chinese rule? And that seems to be the view in Washington, which is that that's really the options that you face. I think developing countries, they don't want either. They just want a system where they can make their own alliances in different domains with their partners. But it is a challenge for the world economic order because our central view of where you get stability in the international economic order is this view that you need a hegemon that's going to provide global public goods. And that's how you get a stable world economic order. I don't think that's a very strong case that you need a single hegemon. But we don't have also a lot of examples of stable, prosperous, multipolar orders either. So that I see, and there I think also there's a very big role for middle powers, the middle income countries, whether it's sort of Brazil's, Indonesia's, South Africa's, India's of the world, where they act not necessarily altruistically, but with an enlightened self-interest, with more long-term self-interest in mind, that when they approach this multipolar, it's not purely transactional, that they're also thinking about the system as a whole. And I think that's going to be an important precondition.
Right. That's a very, very good point indeed. Justin, how do you see China's rising? Well, many of the West seeings it's like China is really a contender to the US. How do you see China? And how do you predict China in the future?
Well, I think if we look, since 1978, China started to open the economy and follow the basic principle of competitive advantages. Certainly, with the government facilitation, because we said competitive advantages only give the opportunity for the country to produce certain goods at the lowest possible cost. But we know in trade, it depends on total cost. And the total cost, includes the transaction cost as well. And then transaction cost is determined by how good your hard infrastructure like power supply, port facility, and road network, as well as soft infrastructure like financial services and so on. And in a developing country, those hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure to begin with are always poor. And under the kind of situation, the government need to prioritize the improvement of hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure and targeting the sector which the country has competitive advantages. So that means for the country to follow the development of competitive advantages also means the government need to adopt industrial policies to facilitate the sector which the country has competitive advantages. But the goal is to follow competitive advantage. That means the sector which we have competitive advantages, we want to facilitate and make this sector to be competitive. But at the same time also means we have many sectors which we do not have competitive advantages. And for that, we will have to rely on import in order to reduce the cost of obtaining the goods or services in those kind of sectors. So overall, I think China is a very good student in the process of the rise of China. And I can prove that. Overall, if you look into the trade growth, in the past 45 years, the annual growth rate of export in China is about 13%. And the average annual growth rate of import in China is 12%. China only have 1% difference between the import and export. And the reason that China need to have 1% higher in the export than the import, because the aging, the rapid rising of aging. So we need to save in order to prepare for the aging. And I think it's rational for any country facing those kind of situation. If you want to be caught by the pension expenditure in the future, you need to save now, you need to keep those kind of difference. And then many people talk about, China's role in the world. They only look into the export part of China. They forget to see the import of China. And actually, China now is the largest destination for other countries export to China. So overall, I think China like to have this kind of globalization in a world rule-based field. Every country follow their competitive advantages with the government to facilitate the sector which they have competitive advantages so they can grow fast. And when they grow fast, their domestic market will become bigger for other countries. So that's China's, what China did in the past and what China hope to have in the future as well.
Do you see that China ever consider itself competing with the U.S. and how likely China will overtake the U.S.?
I think that China certainly is competitive in certain sectors which will overtake U.S. For example, in the labor-intensive sectors. But China so far is not as competitive in some sectors. And so that's the reason why U.S. had the possibility to say decouple from China because they don't want to export those kind of goods to China. And as you see, currently the per capita GDP in China is about $14,000. And the U.S. is about $85,000. So U.S. has an advantage in sector which is more technological intensive, capital intensive, and both human capital and financial capital intensive. And for those kind of sectors, China would like to import. But unfortunately, because of great power rivalry, U.S. do not want to export those kind of product or service to China. And also China need to develop those areas involuntarily. And certainly, China has a dream, like every country has a dream. China wants to become a developed country, and so we can enjoy the same income level with the U.S. But under the kind of situation, does not mean China will preemptive any kind of goods, because fundamentally, we now have two principles in terms of competitive advantages. One principle is that country at a different stage of development. Then competitive advantage will be determined by their factor endowments. And also what like the US, with 85,000 US per capita income, they have capital abundant, but they have labor shortage. And China, with 14,000 US dollars, we have competitive advantage compared to the US in the more labor-intensive part. We have less in the capital-intensive part. So currently, if we want to organize trade, then the Hack-Shorten model will be the best principle. But one day, certainly China may have the same per capita income as the US. By that, then the trade will depend on specialization, right? And so we will specialize on certain areas, capital intensive, human capital intensive. And the US will also specialize in certain areas, capital intensive and human intensive. But we still have scope for trade, just like European country and the US. Their per capita GDP is about the same, but they still have the opportunity for win-win trade. So we follow the economic rationality.
Okay.
It's always to have trade.
Just follow up on
Sure,
this.
sure.
I don't want to maybe
Sure,
Giletti
sure,
and
sure,
Lorenzo want to come in, but I think a lot of policymakers and economists look at China, they obviously see the role of comparative advantage, but they also see the role of extensive industrial policy in shaping comparative advantage as well. I mean, from a deeper economic perspective, they may not be contradictory in the sense that you might argue that industrial policy is just internalizing externalities and ensuring that underlying true comparative advantage reflects itself. But there is nonetheless significant government intervention as well. And so how do you sort of place it in a kind of a framework, or maybe to answer critics that say that it's really subsidies and industrial policies that are shaping these?
Can I
That's
just
very
add
true.
to Danny's
Yeah.
question? Sorry, Justin. But also, I mean, look, this is a created competitive advantage. You have 40% investment rates for decades, 4 decades, which means, this whole idea that it's a Heckscher-Ohlin kind of thing, capital and labor, you are creating capital over these decades.
Yeah,
So you're not relying on a Heckscher-Ohlin argument at all. The Chinese strategy is not a Heckscher-Ohlin strategy, for heaven's sake. It's just the process of creating a competitive advantage.
Can I also add maybe to this? I mean, going back to that framework,
Sorry,
maybe going back.
before you add, for all participants, we're going to give you also a chance to give questions. So it's going to getting more heated. So please be ready with your questions.
There's a
Please,
simple
Lorenzo.
idea, even in the Heckscher-Ohlin model, the idea that the patients will rule the world. So think about consuming today compared to consuming tomorrow. If you postpone consumption today, you want to consume in the future. So all you will do, you will save more. That savings will translate into investment, higher capital, and higher output. The question is, are we really facing an economy that decision to consume and save is dealt by incentives, dealt by the market, or is it basically that we are somehow forcing the country to postpone consumption into the future? So when you have countries with very different domestic approaches into how to think about how, do we have a free-to-choose consumption of households to the intertemporally to consume, or are we actually facing policies, right, that postpone consumption? So that's a challenge. That's a challenge because the rules that were based in the past, I'm going to say until now, somehow interpreted that countries should have very similar market-oriented economies or policies, and we're not seeing that today. And that translates to my second point about industrial policy. Industrial policy should be about identifying what are the market failures, where are the distortions and the wedges in which we should intervene. We cannot think about industrial policy being a policy in which we strategically choose sectors by, I don't know how, only facing the fact that maybe we want to grow. That might be an objective, maximize growth. But we usually think about economies and try to maximize welfare, not so much about growth. So basically, yes, I'm adding to this discussion, sorry.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Pro-
let
yeah,
me,
probably just
Sorry,
give a
that's,
quick response, then I'll come back to Jayati for developing
Okay.
countries questions. Please, Justin.
my quick response that
Maybe
to
closer
Danny's
to the
question.
mic.
Did China, play too much of industrial policy in the past? My answer is no. Because it's always in competitive sense. We know that in the past, we always advise the country not to adopt industrial policies. And China continued to adopt industrial policy to facilitate. Yes, other countries, they play less. But as a result, they face the situation of premature deindustrialization, right? Because they have import substitution in the past with the heavy government protection to sector which they did not have competitive advantages. Now we advise them not to protect those kind of sector collapse. But we also advise the country not to use industrial policies. The sector which they have competitive advantages without a government facilitation to remove the bottlenecks in soft infrastructure or hard infrastructure, they will not emerge. And so, yes, they play less, but they should play small, like China did, to target a sector which they have latent competitive advantages, and to turn those kind of latent competitive advantage into the actual competitive advantages with government facilitation. So that's, yes, that's to Danny. So now we have a balanced view. We start to think, well, every country needs to have industrial policies. But at the same time, we should use industrial policy in the right way, not to do import substitution as we did in the past. Import substitution was industrial policy, but it's a wrong industrial policy. Industrial policy should facilitate the sector which the country has latent competitive advantages and help them to turn into actual competitive advantages. Then coming to the high savings. What's wrong with high savings? Yes, we have very high savings. But our consumption growth rate is so fast. The average annual growth rate in China in the past 47 years was 8.8%. And our population growth in the past, in our 47 years, was 0.8%. So per capita GDP annual growth rate was 8%. Our per capita consumption growth rate in the past 47 years is 7%. So what's wrong with the 7% consumption growth rate? And I said we need to have 1 percentage difference because preparation for aging. So I think that high saving rate, if you look at the Gross Commission report, among those 13 cheaper performing economy after the Second World War, they enjoy 7% or more growth rate continuously for 25 or more years. Among 5 of those characteristics, one is high savings and high investment. Because if you follow your competitive advantages, you'll be so competitive, and you can create a huge profit. With huge profit, certainly you have more to save, and if you save your saving along your competitive advantages, return to saving will be very high. So you're going to have high saving, high investment, and you are going to have high growth, high increase in income, and high saving together with high consumption growth rate. So that will be the best scenario.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. Sorry, Lorenzo, let us hear your point of view on how developing countries respond to the rising of the adoptions of industrial policies. Please.
Okay. Thank you. let me just begin by pointing out that, look, I want to repeat this. China created its competitive advantage. You say latent. How do you know it's there until afterwards? Who knew that South Korea had latent comparative advantage in steel when it doesn't even have iron ore, right? So these are things you say after the fact. You don't know them beforehand. So coming back to the broader issue, what do the rest of us do? The rest of us confronted with one declining giant and one rising giant, both of which have massive economies of scale. I'm looking at Professor Helpman, who has showed us what role that plays in global trade. How do we cope with countries that have got significantly higher economies of scale and therefore lower costs? How are we going to compete in those? What do we do? How can we suddenly say we've got this latent advantage, or we think we have this latent advantage? I think the way we have to proceed is to actually consider, number one, remember that there is also this green transition thing going on. And I think China has played this amazing, fabulous role in enabling a much cheaper green transition for the rest of the world. I think we should actually be welcoming that. I think my own country, we are fools not to be taking full advantage of this. I think everybody should be adopting the technologies, the much, much cheaper technologies that are available. And where you can, yes, please request some transfer of that technology to some of the countries. Hope that they will also be able to produce some of that themselves over time. But otherwise, I think there is no option but to think of, once again, I go back to the idea of coalitions, but markets that would enable some degree of resilience. We don't want a situation where suddenly one country can say, well, we're going to close our market to you, like the US, or another country can say, we're not going to export rare earths to you. So I think there is this issue of not just thinking about your competitive advantage, but recognizing that overdependence on any particular source for either a market or imports is potentially dangerous simply because of the shifting geopolitics. So I do believe in coalitions of, I don't know, everyone likes to say middle powers nowadays. Europe is not a middle power like developing country powers, sorry. You were ex-colonial countries for colonizing countries. It's a very different kind of middle power. So we have to think of a range of countries who look to their common interests to enable a degree of resilience, diversifying both markets and sources of imports. I think that's essentially the broader open industrial strategy that has to occur today.
Okay.
Yes,
I couldn't, because you asked me how to choose sector we have comparative advantages, so I'd like to answer that question. That's a
I'm
very
saying you
important
don't know
question.
till afterwards. There are mistakes. It's okay to have mistakes.
Okay, let's continue.
So
Please, Lorenzo.
I couldn't agree more. I'm going to actually make that point in a different way in a second. Finishing the previous discussion, I think each country can decide to use its resources as it wants. But to understand that this can have policies that you have bigger than neighbor issues. You can decide to have your country in which the share of consumption might be 30% compared to 60%, which is in developed countries. But to somehow believe that that's not going to affect trade imbalances, that's not going to have issues in other countries, I think it's an issue. I think the new rules should potentially try to address the fact that we have countries with different strategies. How do we integrate countries with different strategies into the world economy? That is the challenge. This relates to developing countries. Developing countries now are facing somehow of a challenge. We've seen, because of geopolitical considerations, we see in these countries, Europe, US, and China, starting to use tariffs, starting to use subsidies, different ways, technological also restrictions, access to information and AI. So for developing countries, they have a challenge. Should they commit to a particular block, or should they diversify? I agree 100% with you. I think they should diversify. I think they should trade with China. I think they should facilitate technology with the US. I say they should facilitate investment with Europe. However, on the other hand, resilience in supply chains, but supply chains, I think on critical supply chains. Trying to have resilience on every single supply chain, I think is very costly. This is not free. And what are the critical supply chains? And we saw it. We saw it because we had, unfortunately, we had events in the previous 20 years that show which were the critical supply chains. After COVID, after, the supply shocks that we're having, after the great financial crisis, supply chains that involve food security, supply chains that involve, in some cases, access to certain technologies. So for developing countries, I don't see the best strategies to commit to one particular block, to diversify. So that's kind of my take on this.
Yes, openness and diversifications. Now, if we redesign new global economic order, what will be the 2-3 key pillars that you suggest governments, institutions should really work on, be based on? Danny?
Yeah, so let me get into that by returning back to the China discussion, because I think it connects with precisely the future, because I think I don't think China's growth strategy has been beggar thy neighbor at all. I think it has been an enrich thy neighbor policy. I think the best thing that any country can do for the world economy is to grow very rapidly. Yeah. And as Justin said, there is a macroeconomic trade imbalance, but China's imports, its importance as a market, its importance for investors from the West has increased significantly. That's a result of China's growth strategy. Now, I think it's possible to explain China's growth strategy in a very neoclassical kind of fashion, connecting the intertemporal dynamics with the comparative advantage, which is that if you believe that tradable sectors are sectors where you have actually significant technological learning externalities. So what you want to do is actually subsidize tradable sectors, mostly manufacturing. That's going to sort of produce a kind of a policy that looks mercantilist in the sense that you're producing an export surplus while your income levels are grow, where your tradable sector is just manufacturing, is just developing in the early stages. And then you support these with the macroeconomic policies of an undervalued exchange rate, repressed consumption, but it is putting you, so consumption level starts low, but then as Justin said, it puts you in a trajectory where it's actually growing very rapidly over time. You get more rapid growth. It's also welfare improving because consumption is growing very rapidly. And it's good for the rest of the world because you're producing a bigger market. So in that sense, so we disagree with Justin about whether the strategy was based on comparative advantage or not. I don't think it was. I think it was, I'm much more with Jayati on this. But I think it was, a strategy. I don't think the rest of the world has anything to teach China about how to grow. I do think there are lots of internal challenges, but still. The question about sort of what, I think the reason I wanted to reiterate that is that I think the biggest challenge in how we think about the global economic order as we go forward is that we need to understand that there's going to be a lot of countries with very different types of growth strategies, policy configurations. So as Lorenzo said, how do we integrate different kind of countries with very different policy arrangements into the world economy? Any world economic policy arrangements that would have prevented China from doing what it did at the time, which certainly the WTO rules, had China had abided by them in full, would have done so, I think would be crazy. That's essentially where we were moving with the WTO system by having rules that were so constraining that would have prevented China or future Chinas. So when I talked about moving to a world economic order which is much more in the spirit of the Bretton Woods regime, what I was talking about is moving to a much more kind of a GATT-like system, which is our focus is much more on trade barriers at the border. We don't deal so much about deep economic integration. We understand that different countries will have different economic models, and that the global arrangements should not reach too much into beyond the borders, and we should focus on two actually narrow areas of international cooperation. One, strict beggar thy neighbor policies, and what I mean by strict beggar thy neighbor policies are things like the optimum tariff, where you're trying to exercise monopoly power in trade, or export restrictions, again, that are sort of purely in the spirit of extracting rents from your trade partners, pure tax havens, where the objective is not to attract physical investment, but simply poach tax revenues from other countries, pure mercantilism in a world where there was generalized unemployment. Not if the West was facing high degrees of unemployment, you might say Chinese mercantilism is beggar thy neighbor. That's exactly the sense in which the term beggar thy neighbor in trade was first used by Joan Robinson in the 1930s, but that was a period of generalized unemployment where, in fact, countries trying to improve trade balances were really harming other countries because it was having adverse employment effects in a context of unemployment. And then areas of global public goods, regulating AI, climate change, but they're sort of relatively narrow, and I think it would mean a much less ambitious system of governance, which we need to really sort of have a very good sense of where it's worth putting our efforts into multilateralism, and I would focus on very, strictly on beggar thy neighbor, but through beggar thy neighbor and global public goods.
Okay. That's a very good point indeed, Danny. What will be your suggestions, 2 or 3 key pillars that you think that the world should work on?
My first recommendation is that we may have to change our intellectual roadmap. Just like Jyoti asked, how could you choose sector which you have competitive advantages? If our intellectual framework is one sector models, then you cannot know which sector you are going to have competitive advantages. Even you have 2 sector model, and you assume those 2 sectors are exogenously given, again, you will not be able to choose which sector you have competitive advantages. But we have certain economies after the Second World War. They were able to maintain such a long time of growth with active government facilitation, because that's one of the 5 characteristics of those certain economies. China is one of them. So then we need to get some kind of new understanding. How come they could continuously targeting the right sectors? And they must targeting the right sectors. Otherwise, they cannot sustain the growth so rapidly for so long and turn from low income to middle income to high income. And that comes my new theory, new structural economics, which is trying to bring structural heterogeneity and endogeneity into the framework. And with that, actually, it can give us quite good advice. Which sectors is likely to be latent competitive advantages, and which area you will require government facilitation. That's one thing. And my second answer is that, just like the Prime Minister Carney of Canada mentioned, the global governments after the Second World War, on the one hand, rule-based, but actually unfailed. And I think that the better one should be rule-based and failed. And a fair system will give us the opportunity for each country to explore into their competitive advantages. And if each country follow their competitive advantages, then trade will always be win-win for all the parties involved. Let me stop here.
Okay, thank you, Justin. Could you please give a quick on 2, 3 key pillars that you think the world should work on?
Very quickly, I think, yes, a trade system that enables countries to develop their own domestic policies, industrial or whatever you want to call it, but broadly the policy space for developing countries. But really the bigger thing actually is the control of finance. A global system that enables national control of finance, prevents destabilizing movements of capital, reduces the currency hierarchies that we see in the world today, reduces the debt stress, which also means that developing countries have to move away from a debt-driven development model.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. Please,
So
Lorenzo.
fast, one that we actually seem to all agree is a system that integrates countries that have very different domestic policies in a way in which it benefits all of us. I think that's a big challenge. Again, we shouldn't commit and force countries to follow one particular policy. Let them follow whatever policy, understand potentially what are the externalities and the issue with that. So that's one challenge. Second, I think the new global economic order should also include trade. Globalization, aggregate gains from trade, we know that it actually have materialized, and the world actually has benefit on that, so I don't see a new global economic order without trade. The third one is inclusion. Inclusion, what I really mean is that these aggregate gains somehow need to be able to facilitate, should be easy to go across communities, across different sectors, and across different countries. And to lastly say, I think the field of international trade has gone into a great revolution. Yesterday in the presidential address, actually that was very clear. Today we have quantitative trade models that have multiple sectors, input-output linkages. Quantitative trade models can identify what are the market failures. Quantitative trade models that might actually help you try to think about, should you conduct industrial policy? What are the market failures? Not industrial policy simply on the sake of strategically choosing sectors, as I said before, basically trying to understand what are the market failures and quantify those effects. The big disconnect that I see is between policymakers and academics. And especially in an area that, compared to other areas, an area that has grown a lot in terms of theory, measurement, and that's a big disconnect. Maybe the International Economic Association might be the launching place in which we will facilitate this discussion in the future. Sorry.
Great, great. Now we open for questions. 2 questions. Make it very quick, your name and your questions. 1 person, 1 question, please.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Well, I'm not on the very side of blaming China for what she's producing and for what she has become over-competitive. But I think rather we cannot say, China, you stop, you don't produce, you don't develop any technologies, you don't become competitive. It's impossible. It would only be possible in a world where there is some power-oriented and anti-democratic ruling global order. But in this case, I think the main problem is with the other industrialized countries like US in the first place and also Europe. Because I call this my personal term for this is industry fatigue. US and Europe has incurred some industry fatigue. They are no more having industry policies. US has stopped on producing manufacturing goods and has more been oriented with the service-based economy, and the manufacturing has fallen down to 11% of the GDP, and service sector is rising to 80%, and this has affected heavily her competitiveness and her technological
Okay,
and R&D
so can you please
positions.
go straight to the questions? Is
Well,
it about the industrial policy of China?
No, it is not a question, it's the comment. I think US and Europe should design their own competitive industrial, especially manufacturing policies. This should be the new global order agenda.
Okay, okay, great. Thank you so much for your comments. We receive so many questions here. Can I take 1 question from, yes? Make it very short, your name and direct questions, and to whom you address your questions. Thank you.
My name is Juni Mamik, I'm from Albania. Good news, it will be a question, not a comment. It will be very short. So we all agree that industrial policies play a crucial role, but in Western societies, they are often election-driven. In 2 ways. First, we have to adjust them before elections to win elections, and after election, who knows who comes into power and what kind of policy will be followed. And we have examples, don't need to mention them. So my question would be for Professor Lin, to what extent the current political system in China represents an advantage for developing long-term economic policies, be it industrial policies, enabling environment to develop a competitive advantage? So that's a bit like provocative
Great,
question.
thank you. Questions for other panelists, please? I saw at the back, please. Yes. Gentleman at the back. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, a question following from Professor Caliendo's point about moving away, the new economic order moving away from efficiency, but more than moving away, placing more relatively more emphasis on distributional considerations. And I think that's been a bit lost from the discussion later on, because the focus was very much about growth and average growth. And of course, distributional consideration is very much about dispersion around averages. So I do wonder what you see the new economic order in terms of more consideration on distributional, so dispersion around the average growth would be, in particular when we know that the role of China may be in that respect has been, if not exhausted, it's almost there. I mean, they've lifted so many millions of people out of poverty. And therefore, I would like to know what your view is in this new economic order about the role of African countries, actually, which have been a bit overseen today. Thank you.
Thank you for highlighting a very important point. So, Justin, would you please address very quickly? And the second questions, I would like Jayati to address questions on poverty and distributions. Please.
Okay, I'd like to respond to the second question. Whether the political system in China makes China to be able to have a long-term horizon and to have an industrial policy to be effective. I think that every country has its own political system, and and even some countries, the political system seems to be the same, but the way they operate may be different. And from my own studies, actually more important is the strategies of the country instead of the political system of the country. For example, I mentioned the 13 well-performing economies after the Second World War. They range from countries like China, and certainly like Korea, and like Singapore. But some other countries, they are fully, Western constitutional democracy. And for example, most people think African country, after the Second World War, they did not do well. But actually, that's one African country, Mauritius. It's doing quite well. Now its per capita GDP is about 13,000 US dollars, like Serbia. Okay. And it's a tiny island economy. In the 1960s, World Bank invited James Mirrlees to write a country report for the country. And according to the report, Mauritius was a hopeless country because the country did not have any ingredients which were considered essential for success. But now they are the best performing African country. And the one reason why they have the best performing, again, they target the right industry to begin with. Labor-intensive government sectors in the 1970s set up export processing zone to facilitate their development and active government investment promotion. And based on that, they move up the industrial ladders step by step. And even they have, the constitutional democracy, so they change the government from time to time. But if the strategies work, no matter which government come into power, they will continue to implement that policy because they need to create jobs, they need to export, they need to, generate jobs and revenue for the government. So I think strategies is more important than political institution. And to have the right strategy, you need to have the right ideas about how to design the strategy. And if you'd like to know that, come to read my book.
So Jayati and Lorenzo, you want to have comments on distributional?
Yeah, very quickly, because I think Lorenzo will have more to say on this. And thank you for raising the issue of distribution. I think one critical feature of that, if you're looking at trade issues, is that of employment, which is no longer really seen as a policy goal in many countries. And the Havana Charter actually did have an active recognition of the relationship between trade and employment and the importance of a multilateral system that would ensure that countries can continue good quality employment generation. I think it's a different world in which we have to reconsider the nature of the employment, but definitely we need trade strategies that enable a major policy focus on good quality employment generation. And I would add something that has been ignored in most of our policy discussions so far is the role of unpaid labor and the implications of different trade and financial policies on unpaid labor, which is a huge issue that is generally unrecognized in our profession.
Thank you.
I'll conclude very. I think efficiency should still be the main reason. The issue is how to manage today efficiency with geopolitical considerations that we're actually seeing in the world today, with resiliency, with political, disparity, and that's, I think, was the major challenge. I should not think about focusing away from efficiency. It's how to manage efficiency together with the geopolitical considerations today. And what I meant about inclusion in terms of, it's the fact that there's adjustment costs. There's adjustment costs in terms of how workers, they move across sectors. So how do we facilitate those adjustment costs? And we're basically focusing a lot on globalization as a shock. But I mean, AI is happening. AI is going to be another challenge to the world economy. I can see huge improvements on AI as an aggregate productivity, but it's going to generate some challenges in terms of distributional effects. So how are we going to manage this shock, which we think is going to be positive as trade it is? Free trade generates aggregate gains. How do we get there in a way that doesn't generate another backlash as it has happened in the past? That's kind of my 5 cents.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Let me end by sharing with you how wonderful I work together with Danny on this book. I always take the credit, and Danny is always do the works. So please, Danny, this is another work for you. Please provide the concluding remark.
Okay, I'm going to summarize and provide a cohesive conclusion. I think what we agree on is that the future global economic order is not going to look like its past. So we need a different model. I think it's important to realize that trade and financial integration are not ends, they're means, they're vehicles through which we want to achieve our ends. And I think we're understanding that those ends are broader than just efficiency, resilience, economic security, the green transition, inclusion, employment. I think we have a much richer set of objectives, and whatever global economic order we create will have to incorporate a broader set of objectives than just maximizing trade and financial integration, or for that matter, the gains from trade per se. And it also will have to accommodate, I think, what all of us have emphasized, which is that the world is very different in terms of the distribution of economic and political power today. That is no longer a unipolar order. It's not going to be a bipolar either. It's going to be a multipolar one, and how we accommodate that is part of this big challenge.
Thank you, Danny. As a part of the commitments of the International Economic Associations, we make the book publicly available, so please feel free to download, share it with your students, your networks, and you are most welcome to be our Knowledge Partners. This is one of the results of the Knowledge Partners programs. And the conversations on the global new economic order will be going on, and we believe that working together with you will be part of the solutions to make a better global economic order. With this, please join me a big round of applause to the panelists.